First class isn't for people like you." The words weren't muttered, nor spoken with a hint of discretion, but flung into the cabin air like a challenge, like a warning sharp and deliberate, carrying the weight of old prejudice dressed in modern uniform. The voice came from a tall, impeccably groomed flight attendant, whose navy blazer sat like armor on her frame, stiff with confidence and unbothered cruelty. Around her, passengers stiffened. Newspapers paused mid-turn, glasses of pre-boarding champagne hovered mid-air, but no one spoke. The woman at the center of it, Alyssa Monroe, stood motionless, her expression unreadable, not from confusion but from something deeper. The cold familiarity of being misjudged in public again. She wore a plain black t-shirt tucked into dark jeans, her sneakers spotless, her posture straight, her silence more composed than any polished monologue. She held out her ticket. Heather took it between two fingers like it was something dirty, unworthy of her attention. Without more than a glance, she tore it clean down the middle. The sound of the tear cut through the pressurized cabin like a gunshot muffled by privilege. A few passengers gasped, more looked away. "You can take that attitude back to coach," Heather added with a wave of dismissal already turning her back. Alyssa said nothing at first. Her hand, now empty, dropped slowly to her side. Her shoulders remained still, though her heart did not. Because this was not a misunderstanding. It was not a glitch in the system. It was what happened when people like Heather believed their uniforms gave them the right to decide who was worthy of dignity. Another flight attendant approached, younger, cockier, with too much hair product and too little shame. His name tag read Tyler Grant, and his smirk was the type worn by men who had never had to second-guess their place in the world. "You seriously thought that outfit would fly in first class?" he said, crossing his arms. "Come on. Next time you try to pass, at least dress the part." The insult was dressed as advice, but it landed like spit on polished shoes. Alyssa still said nothing. She reached into her small black purse and pulled out two items: a photo ID and a metal card, heavy and dark and unmistakably elite. The kind of card that required more than wealth to obtain. It required power, vision, ownership. "This is my Founder's Circle card," she said, her voice quiet but unmistakably firm. "Issued by North Star Air. You'll find my name, Alyssa Monroe, on your board of shareholders. Please verify it." Heather didn't even look. "We've seen plenty of fakes," she said flatly. "It's not going to work today." And a murmur rippled through the cabin. A mother glanced down at her child with unease. A businessman lowered his Bluetooth headset, listening. Somewhere near the rear of first class, a phone was lifted, the lens already recording. But no one intervened. The cockpit door opened. Captain Roy Daniels stepped out, his crisp uniform weighed down by the kind of authority that too often goes unchallenged. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask for names or facts. "What's the problem here?" he asked Heather, already looking at Alyssa like she was the problem. "She tried to present a fraudulent ticket," Heather replied smoothly. "We've asked her to leave first class, but she's refusing." Roy didn't hesitate. His tone shifted from inquiry to command. "Escort her out," he said. "We're not holding up this flight." A security officer appeared. Officer Marissa Cole. Alert, rigid, trained to follow instructions first and question them later. She approached Alyssa without expression, her badge catching the cabin light like a warning. "You have 60 seconds to comply," she said. Alyssa's face remained composed, but her eyes, behind wide glasses, were now focused. Not angry, not pleading, just deliberate. She didn't reach for her phone to threaten. She didn't raise her voice to prove her worth. She stood still, letting the weight of their assumptions settle around her like ash. And in that stillness, something extraordinary happened. A voice, a soft, shaking one, rose from behind the galley curtain. "Her ticket scanned valid," it said. "I saw it myself." Everyone turned. A young flight attendant stood half-hidden, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly together. Her name was Naomi Ellis, and she had just risked her job for the truth. Heather's face tightened. "You're new. Stay out of this," she hissed, loud enough for all to hear. But it was too late. Because that was the moment it all shifted. That was the moment the silence cracked. That was the moment everyone began to realize that the woman they had just watched be humiliated might not only belong in first class, but might own the plane they were sitting in. And in less than 5 minutes, the crew who had mocked her would no longer have jobs. Because Alyssa Monroe wasn't just a passenger, she was the CEO. And this wasn't a flight, it was a reckoning. Alyssa Monroe had learned long ago that power only truly mattered when no one knew you had it. She had sat in countless boardrooms, her name engraved on plaques and legal documents, her signature shaping the fate of one of the fastest-growing airlines in the country. Yet, she had never mistaken her position for immunity. Success, after all, did not shield you from suspicion. Not when you were a black woman in America who chose silence over spectacle and substance over status. When North Star Air launched 10 years ago, Alyssa had been its architect, not just of its business model, but of its values. She envisioned a company where service was rooted in dignity, not just dollars, where every passenger, regardless of class, was treated as human first. That dream had built an empire. But dreams, like aircrafts, required constant inspection, because if left unchecked, even the most carefully engineered structures would begin to rot from the inside. She had heard the reports quietly through back channels, through whispers from junior staff, through messages from friends who had traveled recently and returned with stories that didn't match the brand she had built. A black couple asked to switch seats without reason, a Latina mother told to prove her identity twice, an elderly Asian man escorted off a flight for looking confused. All subtle, all deniable, all familiar. Alyssa could have called a meeting. She could have summoned department heads, reviewed incident reports, launched a campaign of polished apologies. But she knew corporate damage control when she saw it, and she wanted truth, not optics. So she made a decision that startled even her closest aide. She would board a flight as a passenger, alone, quietly, in plain clothes, no priority entrance, no pre-flight champagne, no monogrammed luggage or assistant trailing behind her with a clipboard of flight manifestos. She wanted to be ignored. She wanted to be mistaken. Because only then could she witness the culture her silence may have allowed to fester. Her assistant, Candice Lee, had been hesitant. "There are safer ways to investigate," she had said, voice low, eyes cautious. Alyssa had simply smiled. "I don't want safe, I want honest." And so, on a warm Thursday morning, she arrived at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport in Atlanta with a soft leather tote and a heart braced for impact. She wore no makeup, no jewelry save for a small gold stud in each ear, and her favorite black cotton t-shirt, the one with a faint bleach stain near the hem that she refused to throw away. She moved through TSA without incident, boarded without fanfare, and stepped into the first-class cabin of Flight NS 1487 as just another woman with a boarding pass. But she had known, even before Heather spoke, that something was off. She had seen it in the narrowing of eyes at the gate when her ticket was scanned, in the pause before the welcome aboard, in the way no one offered to help her stow her bag. It wasn't hostility, it was something quieter, familiar to anyone who'd been seen as out of place, a subtle resistance to belonging. When Heather approached her, Alyssa had already been prepared. What she hadn't expected, what still pressed uncomfortably against her chest even now, was the speed with which her identity had been dismissed. There hadn't been a moment of doubt or pause. Her name meant nothing. Her calm, her clarity, her credentials? Irrelevant. She had come looking for patterns. What she found was a certainty. This wasn't a bad day, it was a culture. The real heartbreak wasn't that they mistreated her. It was that they had done it so casually, so automatically, as though the act of removal had been rehearsed. As she stood now, watching security step forward, watching passengers avert their eyes, Alyssa thought not of herself, but of the countless people who had been on this exact path before her, quietly judged, quietly erased. Only this time she had the means to do something about it. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she owed the truth to everyone who had been told, in words or in silence, that they didn't belong. The paper, once torn, had no voice of its own, but it might as well have screamed in protest as it fluttered to the floor of the first-class cabin, landing at the feet of silence. There were no shouts, no arguments, just a heavy, suffocating quiet that draped itself over every seat like thick smoke, the kind that stains clothes and lingers in hair long after you leave the room. Heather's hand remained suspended in the air for a moment longer than necessary, the gesture of tearing clearly practiced, as though she'd done it before and had grown accustomed to the sound of ripping entitlement. Tyler, standing too close behind her, was already leaning into the performance, smirking at nothing, arms crossed like a bouncer at a door only he had been given the keys to guard. "You're holding up boarding," he said to Alyssa, his voice laced with irritation barely disguised as authority. "We have procedures, and forged tickets slow everything down for everyone. It's not personal, it's protocol." Alyssa looked at him, not with anger, but with a gaze so direct and unflinching that it seemed for a brief second to pull the smugness right off his face. She reached into her wallet once again, calmly, and presented her identification. Government issued, unmistakable, and placed it next to her black metal Founders Circle card, embossed with her full name and membership number. "You're welcome to scan it in your system," she said. "It will verify what I've already said." But Heather didn't reach for the ID. She looked at the card, tilted her head, and then, without touching either item, sighed. "I'm not here to be fooled by plastic and confidence," she said. "You people always think if you say it loud enough it becomes true." The phrase, "you people," sat in the air like a fly on food, unwanted and offensive, and yet somehow allowed to remain. Alyssa's hand didn't move, her grip still firm around the card, but her voice shifted. Deeper now, slower, as though each word had been weighed before release. "I'll ask one more time," she said. "Verify my information, because the only thing being faked here is your professionalism." The slight, nearly imperceptible gasp that followed didn't come from the crew, but from a woman sitting in 3A, a gray-haired passenger wearing a pearl necklace and the kind of expression that said she hadn't seen anything like this in her years of flying and hoped she never would again. Captain Roy Daniels reappeared at that moment, his authority now demanded by Heather's growing impatience. She explained the situation quickly, framing Alyssa as a disruptive passenger refusing to comply. He didn't ask for details, didn't look at the ID, didn't even pause to consider that maybe this wasn't a case of forgery, but a failure. "Ma'am, I need you to exit the aircraft immediately," he said, not loudly but firmly, the tone of a man who didn't believe in second explanations. Alyssa didn't move. She turned her head slowly, taking in the faces around her, some embarrassed, some curious, a few shifting uncomfortably under her gaze. No one spoke, no one intervened. She bent slightly, picked up the torn halves of her boarding pass, and held them in one hand like evidence in a trial whose jury had already made up its mind. Then she turned back to the captain. "I'm not leaving," she said quietly. "Not until someone does their job and checks the system." Roy narrowed his eyes. "I've made my decision." A second later, Officer Marissa Cole appeared at the front of the cabin, summoned silently but with authority. Her posture was stiff, her face unreadable, and though her steps were controlled, they carried the weight of finality. She approached Alyssa with practiced confidence. "You have 60 seconds to comply," she said, "or you'll be removed." Heather smirked. Tyler chuckled under his breath. The entire moment, choreographed as though Alyssa had walked into a scene already rehearsed, scripted not for truth, but for humiliation. And yet, through it all, Alyssa stood unmoved, her silence now transformed into resistance, her dignity intact even as it was stripped by others. Because she knew something no one else in that cabin did. She wasn't here to ask for fairness. She was here to expose the lie. And she had already gotten what she came for. The silence was no longer neutral. It had shifted from passive discomfort to a tension thick enough to choke on, the kind of silence where every second stretched too long, where people stared not because they were curious, but because they sensed, deeply and without knowing why, that something profoundly wrong was unfolding before them. Alyssa Monroe stood as still as a marble statue, but in her stillness there was no surrender. Her hands did not shake, her voice had not risen, and yet the very act of standing, of refusing to step back, had begun to fracture the confidence of those who had dismissed her. The strength of her composure did what shouting never could. It unsettled the guilty. And then it happened. A voice, barely louder than a whisper, emerged from behind the galley curtain. It cracked, unsure of itself at first, as though the speaker was deciding whether bravery could be borrowed or must be built from scratch. I saw her ticket scan as valid. All eyes turned toward the speaker. She was young, early 20s at most, with a fresh face not yet hardened by years of corporate etiquette or fear of consequence. Her name tag read Naomi Ellis, and though she tried to shrink into the shadow of the cabin wall, it was too late. She had spoken. Heather turned on her like cold wind on an open flame. "Naomi, stay out of this," she snapped, the kind of tone meant to extinguish dissent. "You're in training. This is not your call." Naomi blinked rapidly, as if debating whether silence would still buy her safety, but something about the way Alyssa had stood, unmoved, intact, unyielding, seemed to ripple through her spine. Naomi swallowed hard, then took a step forward, her voice steadier now. "I'm not trying to interfere," she said, "but I saw her name on the manifest. She passed all scans. She belongs in that seat." The cabin seemed to inhale. It wasn't just that Naomi had spoken. It was that she had done so despite everything around her. The chain of command, the unspoken code of loyalty, the threat of retaliation. Her words, fragile and trembling, landed like stones breaking the surface of still water. Tyler scoffed audibly. "New kids always think they know better," he muttered, though the flush on his neck betrayed a flicker of unease. Captain Roy Daniels looked at Naomi with irritation, then at Alyssa, and then, as if to reclaim authority, turned toward Officer Cole. "Proceed with removal," he ordered flatly. But something had changed. Passengers were no longer averting their eyes. A man in 1A, mid-40s sharp suit, Bluetooth headset looped over one ear, raised his phone and began recording. A woman, 2 rows back, white, silver-haired, dignified, pressed her hand to her heart and whispered something to her seatmate. A ripple, invisible but growing, moved through the cabin. Naomi stepped backward, suddenly aware of what she'd done, her chest rising with fast, shallow breaths. She glanced at Alyssa, and for the briefest moment, Alyssa met her eyes and nodded, just once, but with the kind of affirmation that told a frightened young woman she had done something good, something true. And across the aisle, someone else added. Sarah Johnson, a well-known blogger and advocate for social justice, unmistakable in her curly auburn hair and thick glasses, lifted her phone, angled it slightly to capture the scene, and hit record. No hashtags, no commentary. Just a steady image of a woman standing her ground while others tried to erase her. Beside her, Tom Carter, an independent business analyst with a strong online following of his own, followed suit, recording from a different angle. 2 strangers bonded in the silent understanding that injustice thrives when witnessed but not seen. Within seconds, a hashtag formed, unspoken but inevitable, North Star Scandal. Alyssa didn't smile. This wasn't triumph. This was recognition. That sometimes the smallest resistance becomes the match that lights the fuse. She hadn't raised her voice, and yet others had found theirs. She hadn't moved, and yet others had begun to shift. The crew didn't know it yet, but a reckoning had already begun. And in that quiet act of defiance, from a new flight attendant too scared to speak, and a passenger too proud to retreat, justice had started its slow, steady ascent. The silence that followed was no longer complicity, it was expectancy. Even those who still pretended to scroll their phones or stir their ginger ale sensed that the narrative had changed. It was no longer the story of an unruly passenger challenging authority, but the slow, visible unraveling of power built on assumption and unchecked control. The people who had dared to judge now found themselves being watched, and for the first time they did not enjoy the attention. Alyssa reached calmly into her blazer pocket and retrieved her phone, not as a threat, but as a simple gesture of contact. Her fingers moved with precision, and when the call connected, she didn't move away or whisper. Her voice, when it emerged, was clear, clipped, and entirely without theatrics. "Candace, it's me," she said, standing in the aisle like any other passenger making a call, except she wasn't any other passenger. "Activate Protocol 7, boardroom emergency. Send the internal footage and passenger clips to Richard Beaumont and the Ethics Committee immediately. I want a call with the board within 2 minutes." There was a pause on the other end. Then came a steady reply, audible enough to the surrounding ears. "Understood. Already trending. The board is standing by." Heather, Tyler, and Captain Daniels froze, not because they believed her yet, but because her tone had shifted the weather inside the cabin. It was no longer a passenger's plea. It was an executive's directive. And yet, denial is a powerful drug. And Heather reached for one last inhale. "Oh, come on," she scoffed. "What is this? A stunt? A call to a friend pretending to be a secretary?" Captain Daniels stepped forward as if hoping to reclaim the narrative before it slid beyond his grasp. "Ma'am," he said sharply, "if this is some kind of charade, it ends now. Either you comply or you're removed under federal directive." But just then, Alyssa's phone lit up again, and this time she placed it on speaker. A voice came through, steady and unmistakable. "Alyssa Monroe, this is Richard Beaumont. I'm here with the full board. We've received the video clips and Naomi Ellis's testimony. You have full discretionary power. Proceed as you see fit." The air inside the cabin contracted. The temperature seemed to shift by degrees. Passengers who had said nothing now sat up straighter. A few gasped audibly. Heather's smirk collapsed slowly, as if melting under heat. Tyler's arms dropped to his sides, his mouth half open. Captain Daniels blinked twice, his jaw flexing with sudden understanding. Naomi, standing near the galley, looked as though she might faint, but Alyssa turned her gaze toward her and gave a small, nearly imperceptible nod, both thanks and reassurance wrapped into a single gesture. Alyssa lowered the phone and looked directly at Heather first. Not with vengeance, but with a clarity so cutting that it felt like sunlight revealing everything you wished to keep hidden. "You tore my ticket," she said. "You dismissed my ID. You ignored protocol and escalated a situation based on appearance, not behavior. You did not pause to verify. You did not hesitate to humiliate." She turned to Tyler. "You supported that with mockery, with language designed to diminish. You contributed to a hostile culture we have worked for years to eliminate." Finally, she addressed Captain Daniels. "And you, sir, enforced their decisions without due diligence, compromising both procedure and ethics, and did so with full confidence that you would never be questioned." Then she faced the entire cabin, not as a CO, not even as a woman wronged, but as someone who understood the weight of leading by example in moments when the cost was real. "I have tried," she said, "to believe that change can happen from policies and training and memos. But today I have been reminded that culture is built by action, not by language. And when a culture turns toxic, it must be corrected at its root." She paused, let it breathe. "Effective immediately," she continued. "Heather Morgan, Tyler Grant, and Captain Roy Daniels, your contracts are terminated. You are to leave this aircraft within 5 minutes. Officer Cole will escort you. You will be formally notified by HR and legal by end of day. I suggest you do not delay." It was not rage. It was not revenge. It was consequence, measured, earned, and irreversible. Heather's lips moved, forming half-sentences that never made it into words. Tyler looked down at his feet, realizing too late that the power he had flexed so freely was never his to begin with. Captain Daniels didn't argue. He simply turned away, his shoulders suddenly heavier than the stripes on his sleeve. Passengers began to whisper again, but this time it was awe, not discomfort. Phones remained in hands, capturing every detail, not for gossip, but for justice. The woman who had been insulted for dressing too plain now stood not only vindicated, but elevated. Officer Marisa Cole, still standing at the edge of the cabin, straightened her posture and stepped forward with a nod. She spoke quietly, without fanfare. "Please gather your belongings and exit the aircraft." Heather walked first, slow, hollow-eyed, the confident clip of her heels replaced by a soft shuffle. Tyler followed, silent. Captain Daniels, once feared for his discipline, now looked every bit the man who had just seen his entire command unravel at the hands of the very person he had refused to recognize. As the cabin door closed behind them, Alyssa returned to her seat, not triumphantly but purposefully. Because this wasn't just about correcting a wrong. It was about making sure no one else would ever sit in that aisle, hands trembling, wondering if the problem was them. It was never them. And today, finally, everyone could see that. The cabin had not yet returned to normal, but something had shifted. It wasn't comfort, it was clarity. Passengers who had been silent now nodded subtly to one another, not in judgment, but in relief, as if a truth long suspected had finally been spoken aloud and acknowledged. There was no applause, there was no need. Justice, when true, does not require celebration, it simply stands. Alyssa remained seated, her back straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap, not because she needed to compose herself, but because restraint was part of her character. She had been taught long ago, by a grandmother who spoke softly but carried a gaze that could silence entire rooms, that dignity was the most dangerous form of resistance. And she believed that still. Officer Marissa Cole stood nearby, hesitant, uncertain now of her role. Just 10 minutes earlier she had been ready to remove Alyssa with force. Now she stood quietly, her hands clasped behind her back, no longer an enforcer, but a witness, perhaps even a participant in her own small awakening. She cleared her throat softly. "Mrs. Monroe," she began, I need to say, I'm sorry. I didn't ask, I just followed the order, and I should have—" Her voice faltered, the sentence unfinished, but its meaning was whole. Alyssa turned to her, not with condescension, not even with disappointment, but with the kind of gentleness that still holds people accountable. "You've been trained to respond to command, not to truth," she said quietly. "But from today, let's both agree to expect more, from each other and from the systems we serve." Marissa nodded, almost gratefully. From the galley, Naomi Ellis stepped forward again, her posture still unsure but her eyes clearer now. Her hands trembled slightly, but she held something. Her phone. She approached Alyssa carefully, as though uncertain whether she was even allowed to stand near her. "I didn't mean to overstep," she said, her voice soft. "But I have something. I think you should see it." Alyssa tilted her head gently, inviting her to continue. Naomi hesitated only a moment before hitting play. On the screen was a video, grainy, recorded just an hour earlier. In it, Heather's voice was unmistakable, low and hurried. "Delete her name from the seat list," she said. "She's not first-class material. No one's gonna believe that anyway." Tyler's voice followed, snide and careless. "Yeah, just tweak the manifest. No one checks that deep." The cabin gasped, this time audibly. No longer whispers, no longer doubt, just confirmation, solid, undeniable, and recorded in their own words. Alyssa accepted the phone and pressed pause, then she turned back to Naomi. "You could have stayed silent," she said. "But you didn't. You spoke, you stepped forward, and now you've made something better than a career. You've made a difference." Naomi flushed, overwhelmed, uncertain what to say. But Alyssa continued, her voice carrying just enough volume to reach every seat without effort. "Effective immediately, Naomi Ellis is promoted to steward supervisor with full salary adjustment and training privileges. She will help lead our culture review team for in-flight service across all North Star routes." There was a hush, then a ripple of quiet awe. No applause again, but something better. Respect. Earned not by authority, but by courage. Sarah Johnson, still recording, lowered her phone slowly. Beside her, Tom Carter whispered, "This is going to change everything." And perhaps it would. Because Alyssa had not shouted. She had not punished with cruelty. She had made no grand declarations of vengeance. But in choosing to lift someone who had done right, in refusing to gloat and instead choosing to repair, She had rewritten the ending that many had expected to unfold with bitterness. She turned to the remaining passengers, her voice calm but unwavering. I ask that you remember this, not as a scandal but as a reminder. That kindness requires effort, that courage is contagious, and that justice is not a policy, it's a choice we make again and again, even when it's uncomfortable. A few nodded, some bowed their heads. And somewhere between rows 3 and 4, someone wiped a tear from the corner of their eye, not out of sadness, but because they had just seen something rare. Just a woman who had power, but a woman who knew exactly how to use it. The aircraft door had closed behind the dismissed crew, but the weight of their actions lingered like the final note of a sorrowful song, a tone you could not unhear, even as silence returned. And yet, within that silence, something else was beginning to settle. A quiet kind of peace, not of comfort, but of clarity. Alyssa Monroe remained in her seat, not triumphant, not exhausted, but reflective. Her phone rested face down on the tray table, notifications blinking silently into the cotton of her sleeve. She didn't need to see them. She knew the world outside was now watching, that within minutes the video would ripple across timelines and inboxes, stirring voices that had too long grown numb to the everyday injuries of dignity denied. But what mattered most to her now was not the trending hashtags or the headlines to come. It was the girl 2 rows away, still holding her phone as if it were evidence of her worth. It was the passengers who had first looked away, now sitting a little straighter, as if reminded that silence too was a choice. And it was the truth that had always been there, now spoken aloud and finally heard. Officer Marissa Cole returned once more, her posture less rigid now, more human. "I'll be reporting this," she said softly, her voice more confession than statement. "Not just what they did, but what I didn't do." Alyssa nodded, not in forgiveness but in recognition. Growth begins when we stop defending our comfort and start owning our conscience. She turned then to address the passengers, not from a podium, not with rehearsed words, but as one among them, shaped by the same shared spaces and divided by the same silent systems they all too often ignored. "I want to say thank you," she began, her voice even, measured. "Not because I was treated rightly, because I wasn't, but because a few of you spoke when it counted, even if it was late. And that means there is still something worth saving in us." She paused, her eyes sweeping the rows, not as a leader commanding a crowd, but as a woman reminding them what humanity looked like when it remembered itself. "This airline will change," she said. "Not because of policy, but because we will make it so. Together. And I hope, when you tell this story, you don't make me the hero. Tell it as it happened. Let it be a lesson, not a headline." Naomi, still holding her phone, smiled through tears she didn't try to hide. Sarah Johnson lifted her camera one last time and captured a quiet image, not of confrontation, but of reconstruction. A black woman seated in first class, dignified, calm, and no longer questioned. And when the flight finally ascended somewhere over the Mississippi River, the cabin lights dimmed, the noise softened, and something unspoken took flight too. A promise, perhaps, or a prayer. That next time someone was told they didn't belong, someone else would say, "Yes, they do." And maybe, just maybe, no one would need to say it at all.